Now on to Chapter 19, Evaluation Research. And this is an area where I actually teach a program planning and evaluation course, and most of my research, in fact, my dissertation, was around the evaluation of what was called the CTE, or the Career and Technical Education Introduction course, the mandatory course required by all 7th graders to take in Utah, and now what has evolved into the College and Career Awareness course. My research actually focused on the effectiveness, evaluating the effectiveness of the CTE introduction course, and perhaps was a bit of the frosting on the cake that said, yes, we've been sensing some changes were needed, and this research just helps us figure out what needs to be changed and to make some decisions about the mandatory course for career exploration. So evaluation research is something I'm very familiar with, and I think it's something that we very often see inside of educational research, and they use evaluation research throughout your text and the chapters that we will be studying. So the problems of practice here: why have decades of program initiatives in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, produced little evidence that these programs are effective? Now that's somewhat of a loaded statement right there, because I think there are there are studies that have produced some evidence that these programs are effective, but that's taking a look at a specific program. You have a specific intervention. You're hoping to increase the competencies of students in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and that means that you have competency in 2 or more of those areas, not just one, to see that you're moving the needle, that students have that integrated concept of how to apply science, technology, engineering, mathematics to solve problems. And so that's one problems of practice that I think really should resonate with the career and technical education, because quite honestly, most of the work and many of the discipline areas that we do in CTE are related to STEM. My background, as I mentioned, is agriculture. We really have a lot of science, technology, engineering. Many of you are in family consumer sciences. STEM just washes across CTE areas in a very seamless way, really. The other bullet that I have highlighted here: should evaluation research be used to influence the direction of school reform initiatives? Now, this one is one many of you mentioned in your introduction. Our principal, our administration, our district got a hold of some program that was evaluated, that was rated to be evidence-based and highly effective at moving the needle on motivation, learning math, reducing bullying, whatever it might be, a soup du jour that day. But that evaluation research has been used to influence the direction of school reform initiatives. This is, of all the things that I think is a major takeaway in this course, is you're sitting there in a faculty meeting and you've been, you hear about a new program, and all of a sudden it's just foisted upon you, we're all going to do this because it's been done, it's been a pilot, and you're like, okay, but you still have questions, and hopefully this course will help you to ask the right questions. And you don't want to be confrontational, you don't want to be a cynic about new ideas, but you want to be able to ask critical questions that, quite honestly, your administrator should be able to answer. And maybe you don't call them out in a faculty meeting of 20 or more, but you have an individual meeting with them to say, what kind of evidence do we have to support going forward with this? Is it our population? What kind of statistical significance did they see? How much does it cost? If it costs $1 million or $500,000 or $20 per student, is what was measured worth that? Does it have enough merit or worth? And they talk about that in this chapter. Should the evaluation of schools and teachers be focused primarily on how well students perform on achievement tests? And this is, again, an area we talk about all the time. Looking at the schools, grading schools, and we talk about here setting the standards, having the students graded by those standards, and if you didn't meet the standard, your school gets a low mark. Albeit there might be so many other variables about your school. Maybe most of them are English language learners, or they're Title I type schools, or a variety of other reasons where your students have barriers that are going to make it pretty difficult for you to meet the standard. That being said, you might be able to raise their scores from an initial start and get close to the standard. So you have really closed the gap in their understanding, and maybe a conversation about how's that being measured. So asking those kinds of questions, not whether or not they just made the grade. In fact, if you take students who are close to performing on grade level, and voila, you have, you teach them some of the concepts and they learn and they measure perfectly. That's great. But imagine now learners who were way down the scale and had to go a big distance to close the gap. Those are the kinds of questions that you might ask in evaluation. The other bullet, and again, some of these might be really important to you. I'm just making a few highlights here, giving you a few examples of experience. Should schools buy tablet computers for all their students and use electronic textbooks for all subjects? Several years ago, the state of Maine did this. Every middle schooler was given, wasn't necessarily a tablet, but they were given a computer, a laptop. And now, just recently, in the last year or so, after I think this was done about 5 years, they're now measuring whether or not that made a difference in learning. And initial research is finding that not really. But what they are finding is that, did it increase engagement among students? Did students say they were more engaged? Did they seem more on task? Yes, but it doesn't appear at least that it moved the needle for academic achievement. And so that's something to consider, especially when you look at the cost of these kinds of things related to the cost of other materials. So that's just a couple of examples. Maybe more, I'll follow up with that if I can find that recent research. I just heard that from a colleague in Maine, and I actually need to follow up on it. Important ideas. Program evaluation is difficult because programs are seldom uniform, effective, and different stakeholders define effectiveness differently. Some stakeholders might say, well, if you have just a little bit of a percentage increase, even if it's not statistically significant, that's okay for me. Where other stakeholders will say, hey, you're not moving the needle enough. Kids don't know enough about careers. Kids don't know enough about their options or the income or the education they're going to need to select a career. We don't think that's very effective. You're going to see that as a moving target, and that's one of the things that makes a program evaluation difficult. Also, what you're going to learn about in this chapter, there's an element of politics regarding stakeholders, their perceptions, what they value, and some of it gets related back not just to their values, but again, then back to funding and money. 2, programs typically include curriculum materials, instructional materials, assessment procedures, and professional development component. This should not be news to you. Whenever there's a new program, oftentimes you will see, we got a new program, we got new curriculum, we're going to instruct you in how to teach, and I know science educators have been with the new NGS standards. In science, they need to go to a lot of training about how to teach using phenomena related to science. Maybe it's new STEM curriculum. In addition, there'll be new assessments, which always are expensive, and a professional development component. And so all of these things get measured along the way. These are an important part of program evaluation. Each program functions then within a distinct culture, again, making program evaluation not quite like basic research. There's always this element of value and politics and judging its merit and worth, and that's talked about here in this chapter. Bullet number 3, I did get a little heavy-handed with the highlighter. Sorry. This is a really important thing, though, that happens in education with evaluation. It's honestly the most pervasive type of research you're going to see in education is evaluation type research. And so this is a real important chapter to really immerse yourself in the takeaway. And some of you might say, I'm going to write that up. I want to do an evaluation in my school on XYZ program. And I hope that this chapter is helpful for you in that regard. 3, evaluation research is value-laden and political at every stage of the process. I already mentioned that, so now I get to skip down to 4. The identification of program stakeholders and their concerns is important, as in most evaluation studies. And that goes back to the political nature. They spend quite a bit of time on that. And now we're talking about legislators and school boards and parents. They're all stakeholders. The students are stakeholders. Their concerns are important. But there are all these other variables related to that, and they oftentimes relate around funding, priorities, and what one person values in terms of, for example, the college and career awareness class, in terms of exposing students to the career options, the education they're going to need, may not resonate with somebody else who says, it's too early for them. 7th grade, we don't need that. Let's move on. Let's just have them immerse themselves in content and they'll figure that out themselves. They don't value that. And right now you're saying, who wouldn't value that? There are people who don't value that, and they think it's way too early to discuss that. In fact, they'll argue that most people don't even figure out what they want to do until they take their freshman college course, or they get out working and realize, A, I don't want to work in this job, I want to go to college, or B, I don't really like college, I want to go out and get a job. And so you'll have people in those different camps. The model of objective-based evaluations, I like that because that means you're looking at the outcomes. Focus on how well a program helps students achieve specified objectives, or in some terminology, how we measure against the outcomes. This is probably the most typical model I see. There's a logic model. There are specific outcomes we're expecting from a specific intervention. We use those objectives as our measuring area. We use different tools to measure those objectives, and then voila, we come up with whether or not we had any statistical significance related to maybe pre-post or control group with a particular intervention, and determine whether or not we want to actually add that as part of what we do in schools, of course, assessing the costs and a few other things. 6, the model of needs assessment identifies discrepancies between existing condition and the desired condition so that educators can decide whether to improve current program or develop a new one. So some of you may have taken my program evaluation class where we did a needs assessment, just like sort of grounded theory, like going out there and going to a community and say, what do you think's needed? That's a little different than what they talk about in this chapter. In this chapter, they're saying, we already have a program, and it's supposed to be addressing this need. But we want to evaluate it to see, is it really? And if it isn't, what do we need to do to measure the discrepancy between that program and what's really needed? How do we need to change it, or do we need to develop a new one? So this is also pretty common inside of education, and when you're looking at evaluation types of things, is existing programs. How important is it to educators? How important is it to stakeholders? And then how maybe comfortable the educator is teaching that content. And if there's a big discrepancy between what administrators think is important and what teachers feel comfortable with communicating, that means that there's probably a giant gap in either professional development or just preparation on the part of that teacher to teach that content, which means it's probably not being done very well. So that tells you we need professional development, or we can do it from the student's perspective to the teacher and so forth. And they talk a little bit about that needs assessment discrepancy between the existing condition, what we really want, and looking at programs and seeing if they meet that or not. The other items here I haven't highlighted, but important in this chapter, are looking at the specific types of models for evaluation. So I'm going to skip down and look at a few of those. Again, they highlight here the very key terms, and they'll pop out to you. Some of them I ask about in the quiz, so you'll be able to pick those out and look at them. But these are all important terms that are inside of this chapter. The one I want to take a look at here, again, like we did in action research, they start out right away. In education, evaluation research, also called program evaluation or program evaluation research, is the process of using quantitative or qualitative methods, or both, we call it a mixed methods, to make judgments about the effectiveness of a particular aspect of education. So now I think if every one of you reflect on that, you probably see that this happens all the time. And then those programs are brought forward to you as, this is evidence-based, this is something we need to be doing in our school. And that's why I say these are the most common. These are the areas I've worked in my area of agricultural literacy, is really looking at interventions to see if they moved the needle and got to the outcomes we were hoping for. If they didn't, what happened inside of our model? If there was a logic for this, it's the logic of, we can bring this educational program, we can do a really good job of implementing it, and that will meet our outcomes. And sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes we are imparting something that people learn about and they can pass a test on. I'm thinking of perhaps like smoking. For example, you have an anti-smoking type of lesson. You bring into them all of the health concerns, all of the problems. They can take a test. They know what's wrong. They've seen a black lung. They understand that. But then they still continue to smoke. And you're saying, wait a minute, that was our smoking intervention program. That should have worked. Why didn't it? Because maybe it didn't address other issues related to smoking. So evaluation research has a lot of complications. It has ill-structured problems or variables that enter into it, and that's something you need to consider while you're reading this chapter. I want to just jump ahead then to the specific models on page 534. Those of you who select to do an evaluation, which is option B, an evaluation proposal for your final paper, you're going to want to kind of highlight some of the more important models here and think about which one you'll use to assess or evaluate a program that you're looking at. So, for example, if you want to look at a program that's existing to see if it's meeting the needs, you would say, I'm going to use a needs assessment model, and it's discussed right here. I skipped over there. Objectives-based evaluation. If you're going to look at the outcomes, and quite honestly, even in a needs assessment, you're looking at outcomes. But for example, in the College and Career Awareness or CTE intro course, I was looking at the specific objectives of what should be accomplished in that course and then measuring those with the students. It was a pre-post design. I evaluated or took a measurement at the beginning of the course and then waited, yes, 7 months, and took a post evaluation of 6,074 matched pairs. Or a repeated measures design where I had the same measure several months at the end of the year for that particular course, and I was looking at objectives. So you're going to want to pick a model. So pay attention to the models and how they're introduced. The SIP model, they present this as the very most comprehensive model. This is definitely long-term. This is something that if you're a professional evaluator, yes, there are people who spend their entire career just doing program evaluations. And in fact, a lot of times people will call in special contractors to remove bias about a program and to hopefully reduce stakeholder inputs, keeping in mind that you still always have to have that lens or that thought about what stakeholders think in an evaluation. But this is the most comprehensive way. Sometimes we're looking at the context here, the needs, assets, and problems of stakeholders and staff and the beneficiaries of the program. That's part of a model. The input evaluation, where we're looking, do we have enough input to actually carry out and be successful in this? The process, you evaluate the process. Maybe you determine that a program is not being effective. And the reason it's not being effective is because it's not being implemented in the way that it was designed. And your research, your process evaluation would tell you that. The product evaluation. This is where I see the greatest number of educational research projects. They may discuss these elements inside of the SIP model inside of their program evaluation, but at the end of the day, they're interested in the product evaluation to assess whether the program succeeded or failed. And that's also determined by the stakeholders, decision makers, because they have to decide the threshold of failure or the threshold of success. Product evaluation has these 4 subparts. So if you choose to do a product evaluation, you're really looking at these 4 things, and you could look at more than one. But what impacts has that had? Did it really move the needle for the right target audience? What was the effectiveness? And you have to define what effectiveness looks like. The quality, significance of the program's outcomes. Were they somewhat surfacey, as I found in my research on the College and Career Awareness or CTE intro course, where they weren't, the areas that we were looking for real big significance were really small effect sizes, and you'll learn more about that. It just didn't move the needle as far as we really thought it would be, and it was hopefully a year-long course should have a giant effect. Sustainability evaluation, whether or not the program is institutionalized successfully so it can have some short-term and long-term goals. And oftentimes you shouldn't even begin a program unless you know that there's sustainability, but you are looking for that in your product. These are the 4 things under the product. And then the transportability of the evaluation, whether it can be adapted or institutionalized in other settings, and that means that your findings are generalizable to a different population. So that's the SIP model, and in your evaluation, if you choose to do this in option B, you wouldn't necessarily have all of these. You could have components of them that you discuss in your methods, but if you're doing product, you're probably going to have to assess these 4 areas here. I just bring that up so when you're reading, you can kind of make notes that way if this is an area you're thinking of doing. All right, responsive evaluation. This is another model. You might choose to do this, but this is one that focuses on identifying and describing stakeholder issues, their points of contention, different stakeholders, and concerns or matters about which stakeholders feel threatened or want to substantiate their point of view. Concerns and issues tend to provide a wider and different focus of evaluation study than the program's objectives that are central to the objectives-based evaluation. All right, so this responsive evaluation, I've actually popped out a note here to myself. For example, those of you in family consumer science, family and consumer science stakeholders may view family consumer science courses differently than the Utah State Board of Education. And I think that many of you that are in this discipline have heard folks say, well, we don't really need those types of skills anymore. They don't belong in the workplace. And your point is that, wait a minute, what do you mean workplace? You can't have work-family balance without these types of skills. You aren't going to be very effective in your work. And then there are some of your courses that you say are directly related to the workforce. For example, food and nutrition, culinary arts, and so forth. But again, that's a stakeholder point of view. So you might want to interview, do some research with the stakeholders. Does the state of Utah, do parents in the state of Utah value the types of concepts that you would think are important in, for example, family and consumer sciences? So read that with that lens, or read it with the lens of whatever discipline you teach. But that's really what you're looking at in a responsive evaluation. And it can be very powerful, because if you can use that evidence with lawmakers for funding, saying it's important with our stakeholders, whether you think it's important or not, in moving the needle for the one thing that you value, which might be ready to go into a career or ready to go to college, may not matter if the stakeholders are, it's pervasive, if the message is overwhelming that they value other concepts that are being taught in your course. Spend some time thinking about that one. The SIP model, then, it just has this idea of what you would put for a standard of quality of practice. So if you're using the SIP model for your evaluation, I'm not going to go over that, but I do want to jump ahead to the, let's see, it's page, gotta jump over, here we go. They talk about the SIP model in quite a bit of detail, but let's look over at this research, educational research and development. This is another area that I see used quite often in evaluation studies. Is you basically are going to do some research, develop a product, and then you're going to evaluate it. And it goes back to the SIP model where you're looking at the actual product. But in this case, you're using a smaller sample, oftentimes a pilot study. But consider doing an R&D type of educational evaluation if you want to develop let's say you want to take your course that you're currently teaching and make it a flipped classroom. You want to put the instruction, lectures and modules and so forth in one set, and then have students come together to do the practicums, the lab work, whatever it might be. And you might actually set up a control group. This is a type of thing that would be involved in an educational research type project. So I think there were one of you that mentioned this or more in your introductions. This might be an area that you want to investigate for your final paper, and then it gives a nice flow through chart here. All right. Those are my takeaways from these two chapters. They hopefully give you some idea of how they are practical within career and technical education, and also give you some ideas for maybe thinking about, as you're going through this course this semester, what it is that you're going to choose, what you're going to focus in on for your final paper, whether it be reviewing 3 articles, doing a critical review and deciding whether or not you would apply the research from these articles, or writing a proposal for an action or evaluation research project. If there are any comments or questions, as usual, you can send me an email or mention them in the discussion, and I look forward to reading your comments in this week's discussion.